we have been discussing about environmental ethics, and this is a paper that is being floated in the 7th semester GE in University of Delhi from the Department of Philosophy. And we have been discussing how there are certain policies which deals with the sacred framework of the sites vis-a-vis the sacred spaces, and we will be continuing with this model today. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, environmental ethics has long been critiqued by feminist philosophers for reproducing the same dualisms: mind, body, culture, nature, male, female, reason, emotion, that underlie both ecological destruction and gendered oppression. A feminist eco-philosophical reading does not merely add women to environmental ethics, it reconfigures the moral imagination by foregrounding embodiment, vulnerability, care, and relationality. Now, Kamakhya Nilachal Hills, with its unique ritualization of the menstruating earth, offers an exceptional site to develop such a reading. Unlike dominant religious traditions that conceal, stigmatize, or purify menstruation, Kamakhya publicly acknowledges bleeding, fertility, and bodily cycles as sacred. Here in this lecture, we try to develop a feminist eco-philosophical interpretation centered on earth-body continuity, menstruation as ecological time, and care as ethical practice. Eco-feminist thinkers such as Plum Wood and Caroline Marchant argue that Western rationalist traditions construct nature and women as passive, inferior, and exploitable. Nature becomes a mission, the female body becomes a problem to be controlled. Environmental ethics that ignore embodiment risk reproducing these hierarchies by privileging abstract principles over lived vulnerability. Ecological crisis and gender injustice share a common metaphysical root: the denial of dependency and corporeality. The universal ethical frameworks often erase gendered experiences, like care work remains invisible, bodily labor is undervalued, cycles of reproduction are excluded from moral theory. A feminist eco-philosophical approach insists that situated, embodied knowledge is not a weakness but an ethical resource. At Kamakhya, the goddess is not represented through a distant icon but through earth, rock, moisture, and blood-like symbolism. This collapses the divide between sacred and biological, divine and corporeal. The earth is not metaphorically female, it is materially reproductive. Menstruation as ecological truth. Where menstruation in many cultures is associated with impurity and exclusion, Kamakhya radically resignifies menstruation as a sign of fertility, a moment of vulnerability, a cosmic ecological event. During Ambubachi, the earth rests, human activity pauses, agriculture stops. With the feminist insight being what patriarchy marks as pollution, Kamakhya marks as power and necessity. So if we talk about linear time versus cyclical time, we see that menstrual time and ecological temporality, there is a connect. Modern development follows linear, uninterrupted time, constant productivity, permanent growth. Menstrual time, by contrast, is cyclical, interruptive, rest-oriented. Kamakhya institutionalizes this alternative temporality through ritual cessation. Ethics of pause. The ethics of pause challenges extravist logics that treat rest as inefficiency. Feminist philosophy reframes rest as ethical necessity for both bodies and ecosystems. Kamakhya thus becomes a cultural enactment of what ecofeminist describes as care for limits. Now, care ethics and sacred ecology is extremely important when we are talking about ecological restoration, for care is seen as a relational practice. Feminist ethics of care, like Gilligan and Held, emphasizes attention to vulnerability, responsibility emerging from relationship, context-sensitive moral reasoning. Kamakhya's sacred ecology operates through care, center for the earth's cycles, care enacted through restraint, care embedded in collective ritual. From mastery to maintenance. Rather than mastery over nature, Kamakhya models maintenance ethics, which is keeping conditions for life intact. This aligns with feminist analysis that values sustenance over domination. So we see that the control over land and control over women's bodies often operate through similar logics of extraction and surveillance. A feminist eco-philosophical reading connects environmental degradation, reproductive control, displacement of local communities. Kamakhya offers a symbolic counter-narrative where reproductive power is revered rather than regulated. A critical feminist reading avoids idealization. Women priests and authority remain limited. Ritual power does not automatically ensure gender justice. However, symbolic recognition of menstruation still constitutes a radical ethical rupture in dominant religious ecologies. Now, we had already compared the feminist insight of Kamakhya and other sacred sites. In Sabrimala, for example, discipline through bodily denial. Kedarnath was all about transcendence through asceticism. Mecca is order and purity. Uluru was about ancestral continuity. Now, Kamakhya is distinctive in affirming bodily processes rather than suppressing them. So, a feminist eco-philosophical framework suggests incorporating cycles of rest into restoration planning, valuing maintenance and care labor, designing policies attentive to bodily and ecological vulnerability. This reframes restoration as ongoing care, not one-type repair. A feminist eco-philosophical reading of Kamakhya reveals an environmental ethics grounded in embodiment, menstruation, vulnerability, and care. By sacralizing the bleeding earth, Kamakhya destabilizes patriarchal, extravist, and productivity-driven moralities. In the context of the Anthropocene, such an ethic offers a profound reminder. Ecological survival depends not on endless control, but on learning when and how to rest, bleed, and renew. So, as an environmental ethicist enthusiast for concern of ecological restoration and as a student of philosophy, our questions then would be, why is a topology of sacred ecology is important? Now, sacred sites across cultures are often treated as exceptions, unique, incommensurable, and resistant to theory. While this protects them from reductive generalization, it also limits their contribution to comparative environmental ethics, ecological restoration theory, and policy frameworks. A theoretical typology or typology does not flatten the difference, rather it identifies recurring ontological orientations and ethical logics through which communities relate to land, non-human life, and cosmic order. So here what we are proposing is a plural, non-hierarchical typological of sacred ecologies grounded in philosophy, anthropology, and environmental ethics. Kamakhya functions as a generative role, not a norm, allowing comparison without subsumption. The methodological note, how this typology is constructed. This typology is derived from comparative philosophy of religion, environmental ethics, both Western and non-Western, indigenous and sacred land studies, feminist and care ethics perspectives. Each type is defined by ontology of nature, what the world is, human-nature relation, how humans belong, ethical logic, what counts as right action, temporal orientation, how time is understood, ecological implication, what practices follow, and types are ideal, typical, Weberian, not mutually exclusive. Many sites exhibit hybrid forms. Type 1. Fertility, which is regenerative sacred ecological ontology. Nature is self-generative, reproductive, and cyclical. Earth is a living body capable of exhaustion and renewal. Ethical logic, ethics centers on rest, restraint and regeneration rather than purity or control. Temporality, cyclical, seasonal, menstrual, agricultural. Kamakhya of Nilachal Hills, earth as menstruating, fertile, vulnerable. The ecological implications, ritualized pauses in extraction, acceptance of decay and return, restoration as realignment with cycles. Type 2, ascetic, austerity, sacred ecologies, ontology. Nature is a testing ground for spiritual discipline. Materiality is real but morally secondary. Ethical logic, self-restraint, renunciation and endurance purify both human intention and landscape use. Temporality, linear pilgrimage cycles, episodic intensity and exemplary sites, of course, the Kedarnath, Himalayan monastic landscapes, and the ecological implications, low permanent habitation, fragile balance, vulnerable to mass tourism, emphasis on minimalism often undermined by infrastructure expansion. Type 3 is purity, order, sacred ecologies, ontology, where nature is morally ordered and must be kept within divinity sanctioned boundaries. Ethical logic, maintenance of purity, cleanliness and ritual order. Temporality, calendrical, regulated, repetitive. Exemplary site, Mecca, the Haram zone, and the ecological implications, strict zoning and behavioral codes, strong governance capacity and risk of technocratic environmental management detached from local ecologies. Type 4, disciplinary moral formation of sacred ecologies, ontology, which is landscape shapes moral subjects, environment is a pedagogical space, ethical logic is discipline, obedience, bodily regulation, temporality, ritual cycles aligned with moral testing, and the exemplary site is Sabrimala, of course, where ecological implication is the seasonal ecological pressure, strong codes but limited ecological reflexivity, environmental protection framed as moral duty. Type 5, ancestral community sacred ecologies, ontology, where land is ancestral presence. Humans are custodians, not owners. The ethical logic is obligation to past and future generations. Temporality is deep time, dreaming, cosmological continuity. An exemplary site, of course, the Uluri, where the ecological implication of strong protection through prohibition, resistance to commodification, emphasis on non-intervention rather than restorations have been discussed. Type 6 is all about stewardship. Conventional sacred ecologies, ontology, where nature is divine, trust granted to humans. Ethical logic is the responsible stewardship under drive mandate. Temporality is historical linear with ecological horizon, and the exemplary traditions is Abrahamic environmental ethics, varied expressions, and the ecological implications is the moral justifications for conservations and tension between dominion and care. Now, many contemporary sacred sites operate as hybrids shaped by tourism economies, state economies, climate change, urbanization, and Kamakhya today combines fertility as regenerative ontology, stewardship, governance pressures, disciplinary crowd management, understanding hybridity prevents nostalgic or absolutist policy designs. So, this typology reveals that there is no single sacred ecological ethic. Environmental degradation often occurs when ethical logics and material practice diverge. Restoration must align with a site's ontological grammar, and Kamakhya's strength lies in making vulnerability, rest, and regeneration ethically central, a resource largely absent in modern environmental governance. So, the typology can guide sacred ecological impact assessment, or the SEIA, site-specific restoration models, conflict mediation between religion and conservation, cross-cultural environmental dialogue. Rather than imposing uniform conservation templates, policy must ask what kind of sacred ecology is this site enacting. As such, a theoretical typology of sacred ecologies enables philosophy to move from admiration to appreciation. By recognizing multiple ontologies of land and life, environmental ethics gains conceptual tools capable of engaging religion, culture, and ecology without reduction. Kamakhya's fertility regenerates sacred ecology emerges not as a universal model, but as a critical corrective reintroducing care for limits, cycles, and bodily truth into the ethical imagination of the Anthropocene. Now, we will try to recall the journey from environmental ethics to sacred ecologies to unpack what we have been so far doing. So in this lecture, the work had begun with a fundamental concern in environmental ethics, which is why dominant moral frameworks have struggled to halt ecological degradation, despite decades of conservation discourse, legal instruments, and scientific consensus. The guiding intuition was that ecological crisis is not merely a technical failure, but a philosophical and ethical one. A crisis how humans imagine their relationship with the earth. By engaging traditional and religious environmental ethics, comparative philosophy, Indian metaphysical frameworks, feminist eco-philosophy, and sacred site studies, this lecture has argued that sacred ecologies offer alternative ethical grammars capable of reorienting restoration practices, policy, and moral imagination. Also, the environmental ethics, when we are revisiting now, let us also revisit the limits of dominant paradigms. The early analytical sections of some of the preceding lectures that we had already done demonstrated that mainstream environmental ethics, whether anthropocentric, biocentric, or ecocentric, often remain abstract and principle heavy, detached from living cultural practices, weakly embedded in everyday moral life. While thinkers such as Leopold and R. Naes and Paul Taylor made decisive contributions by decentering human supremacy, their frameworks largely presupposed a secular, rational moral subject. This limits their reach in societies where environmental relations are mediated through ritual, myth, and sacred obligation. The comparative analysis did not reject these thinkers. Instead, it repositioned them as necessary but insufficient for culturally embedded ecological restoration. Also, we had seen how the Indian philosophical resources, the Rita, Dharma, and the Prakriti, are intertwined when we are talking about restoration of environmental ethics. The integration of Indian philosophical frameworks marked a decisive turn in this lecture. Rita introduced the idea of cosmic and ecological order. Dharma reframed ethics as a contextual obligation rather than abstract rule. Prakriti challenged the nature-culture divide by affirming material vitality. Thus, these concepts enabled a shift from environmental ethics as management to ethics as participation in order. Importantly, they allowed ecological harm to be understood not only as a material damage, but as a moral and cosmological dissonance. Thus, Kamakhya as philosophical site, what we tried to do in this lecture was to move from a case study to a generative model. So the Kamakhya Nilachal Hills did emerge not as an illustrative example, but as a philosophical site, a place where ontology, ritual ecology, and ethics converge. The sacred recognition of the menstruating earth or the menstruating goddess disrupts dominant narratives that associate purity with control and productivity. Through Kamakhya, restoration was reconceptualized as realignment with ecological cycles, respect of vulnerability and rest, ethical restraint rather than continuous intervention. This marked a movement from conservation as protection to restoration as ethical realignment. A central contribution of this work lies in demonstrating that sacred ecologies are not merely symbolic but operationalizable, which is the methodology work here translated philosophical commitments into participatory research designs, ritual ecologistic calendars, and sacred ecological impact assessments, community-state collaborative governance. By doing so, it challenged the assumption that spiritually and or spirituality and policy belong to separate epistemic domains. Instead, it proposed transdisciplinary praxis where ethics, ecology, and culture co-produce restoration outcomes. The comparative analysis of Kamakhya, Kedarnath, Sabrimala, Mecca, and Uluru demonstrated that sacred sites enact distinct ecological ontologies: fertility, regenerate, ascetic, austerity, purity, order, disciplinarity, moral formation, ancestry, continuity. This pluralism resists universal prescriptions and underscores a key insight. Ecological failure often occurs when governance models ignore the site's underlying sacred logic. This typology of sacred ecologies consolidated this insight into a transferable theoretical framework. Also, the feminist eco-philosophical section of this lecture deepened the analysis by foregrounding embodiment, menstruation, care, and rest as ethical categories. Kamakhya's ritualization of bleeding goddess offered a rare counter-ethic to patriarchal extravist temporalities. Care ethics reframed restoration as ongoing maintenance rather than one-time repair, relational responsibility rather than managerial control, attentiveness to limits rather than mastery. So this feminist synthesis revealed that ecological sustainability is inseparable from how societies treat bodies, human and non-human alike. Also, the policy and governance from sacred sites to ethical futures, we see that the policy's brief translated philosophy insights into governance tools. Key innovations included the sacred ecological impact assessment of a just ecological impact assessment, zonation based on ritual ecological sensitivity, inclusion of ritual specialists and local communities. Now, this demonstrated that sacred ecologies can inform environmental governance without violating secular principles, provided policy recognizes cultural plurality. Also, the theoretical integration, that is what this work ultimately argues, is that the threaded across all the segments in this lecture is a single unifying argument, and this argument is ecological restoration requires ethical frameworks that recognize vulnerability, cycles, and relational obligation, not merely efficiency, control, or sustainability metrics. Sacred ecologies, when critically engaged, offer precisely such frameworks. Kamakhya's fertility regenerative sacred ecology stands as a critical corrective to dominant Anthropocene ethics, reintroducing pause, rest, and reverence for bodily processes into ecological thought. Thus, the key contributions that I can think about from this lecture is a theoretical typology of sacred ecologies, a Kamakhya-centered restoration framework, integration of feminist eco-philosophy with sacred site ethics, and operational methodology bridging philosophy and policy. And of course, in the future research, there could be the comparative studies across lesser-known sacred landscapes, just like we did with the Kamakhya model now. Longitudinal assessment of the sacred economic impact assessment implementation, the gender and authority within the sacred ecological governance. In the face of accelerating ecological collapse, this lecture does not propose a return to tradition, nor a rejection of modernity. Instead, it calls for ethical humility, the willingness to learn from cultures that have long understood the earth not as a resource but as a relation. Kamakhya reminds us that the earth is not endlessly productive, endlessly pure, or endlessly resilient. It bleeds, it needs rest, and then it renews. To restore ecological futures, humanity must learn to do the same. Now, very quickly also, we have to see the conceptual significance of the work of ontological authority of sustainability in Hindu traditions, where Khalil and Shobha's argument is important because it shifts sustainability from a policy-derived norm to an ontologically grounded ethical principle within Hindu traditions. Rather than treating sustainability as a modern add-on to religions, they argue that Hindu cosmology already authorizes sustainable living at the level of being. So the key philosophical claims where sustainability as ontological, not instrumental, is that sustainability is not justified because it works. It is justified because reality itself, which is Sat, is structured relationally. Harm to nature is therefore ontological disruption, not just ecological damage. Rita, as a cosmic ecological order, the sustainability derives authority from Rita or cosmic order. Human action is ethical when it aligns with order, not when it maximizes output. This directly supports our argument that restoration is moral realignment. Dharma as situated ecological obligation. Dharma is context-sensitive, place-bound, and relational. Environmental responsibility is not universal abstraction but lived duty. This resonates with our Kamakhya-centered framework. Prakriti as a self-regulating reality where nature is not passive matter but active, regenerative, vulnerable. Over-extraction violates the autonomy of Prakriti. This strongly parallels the deep ecology's intrinsic value thesis. As we can see from the PPT that is being shown here, the connections with deep ecology with Khalil and Shobha's positioning Hindu traditions as ontological allies of deep ecology, but with a crucial difference is in the following table: deep ecology and Hindu ontology. Deep ecology of Nes is intrinsic value of nature. Hindu ontology is sacred immanence of Prakriti. On the former, it is about ecological self-critique of anthropocentrism. In the latter, it is Atman Brahman continuously critique of the Ahankara egoism. In the former, the deep ecology is about the biospheric egalitarianism. In the Hindu ontology, it is the dharma-based relational hierarchy. And in the deep ecology, it is all about deep ecology. But of course, in Hindu ontology, it is Hindu ontology because that it bring in the notions of Prakriti, they bring in the notion of Dharma, and surely they bring in the notion of Rita when they are focusing on nature, and it is just not nature as a resource. So we see that Khalil and Shobha argue that sustainability in Hindu traditions derives its authority not from pragmatic environmental outcomes but from ontological structures of reality itself, where all these three things, the Rita, Prakriti and Dharma, comes hand in hand. So while Western environmental ethics articulate sustainability as a moral extension or policy imperative, scholars such as Khalil and Shobha demonstrate that in Hindu traditions, sustainability derives its authority from ontology itself, where ecological order, that is Rita, precedes ethical deliberation. This ontological turn enables a rethinking of restoration not just as a technical repair but as an ethical realignment. With this, we come to an end of our lecture on the ethical restoration vis-a-vis the sacred spaces, where we had picked up with the example of Kamakhya as an application instance, and we had posited it with some more sacred spaces examples. And this makes us to come to a closure of the syllabus of the environmental ethics that has been prescribed in the GE semester 7 of University of Delhi. We will be discussing a new paper in our next lecture. Thank you so much.